What if 80% of your hard-earned audience could vanish overnight because one platform decision you don't control? We pour our time, energy, and money into platforms like TikTok and Spotify, chasing viral moments, playlist ads, and follower counts. It feels like the way to build a music career, right? But relying solely on those platforms is like building your house on quicksand. Algorithms change without warning, platform policies shift, accounts get banned or deplatformed, entire apps face potential bans, and suddenly that audience you thought was yours, it's gone. It's a massive risk most artists don't fully see until it's too late. But there is a smarter, safer way to build your career. What if you could create a resilient audience that follows you, not just the platform? An audience that you actually own. Dan Roy Carter, who has deep experience working inside giants like Spotify and TikTok, reveals why diversifying your presence and building direct connections is no longer optional, it's crucial for survival. Stick around to hear his critical insights and strategies.
Taking the time to understand who you're marketing to. I think that's one of the places that I see people skimping so often. There is no excuse between like the default analytics that people are given access to now through their social media channels, through Spotify, through Apple Music, through all of this. You still need to start with an end in mind, and you always have a baseline to be able to see, like, right, where does my audience exist currently? Where are there any markets that are starting to prop up that actually, with a bit of investment and a bit of, TLC, we could impact more? So I think the fundamentals of that don't really change. You need to start with an end in mind. I don't think you should just be casting your net, far and wide. I think a global picture has to be fragmented into sort of like micro strategies. The invention or the sort of rise of UGC versus now the AI debate and conversation, and how that has sort of both empowered and enslaved, let's say, in various walks. And so being willing to stay on top of the new mediums, but then also not just leaning into one platform at any given time. And I see people doing this all the time, when
I was going to ask about that.
We're going to be the TikTok label. Like, well, okay, but do you need to be the TikTok label? Or can you be the label that uses TikTok really well for this purpose, but then also has this platform doing its thing and this platform doing its thing? And even since prior to joining TikTok, when I had my first company, Unapologetic Group, I was always for parity across platforms. And if we were working really closely with Spotify, I wanted to know what the conversation with Apple Music looked like. And I wanted to understand what we could do with Deezer and what we could do eventually with like Amazon Music and such, because that is what makes up the global ecosystem, right? It's not, and it shouldn't be just one platform. Anecdotally speaking, I'm really happy that this fuss about TikTok being banned has somewhat died down. And it looks like that for now, touch wood, it will remain undisturbed and available in the United States of America. That said, there were several people at the time who I was talking to and going through their audience analytics, turning around to them and saying, hey, if TikTok had been banned in the US, you would have lost upwards of 80% of your total audience overnight. Now, that is a huge problem. And, I'll flip that. What if that ever happened to Spotify and you've built your entire audience base on that platform, let alone the fact that even if you're an independent and you've built your entire audience base on that platform and you now have to give them 30% of revenue to be opted into discovery mode to get algorithmic preference as it is. Like, we need to be on all of these platforms. We need to be doing our bit with all of these platforms, but I don't think you can afford in the modern market to just specialize in one platform, personally. And I hate to see that. Back in the day, it used to be that you'd have a different licensing partner for each territory and they would each specialize in that territory. Now, I think we're seeing that a lot less nowadays. And instead, people lean on specialist marketing and promotional agencies or third parties or platforms to start targeting that such. And I think I'm old school. I like a mailing list. You know what I mean? I like being able to segment audiences and see how they react to things and working out what makes one audience member, a really high value audience member compared to somebody a bit more passive.
I think that comes back to email marketing that you were talking about earlier. I love that you brought that up because email marketing is something that
anybody can really learn and get the hang of. How MailChimp is easy enough to figure out. Whatever the other, whatever you decide to use, that's something that you can teach yourself over time, and owning your audience. And like you said, segmenting them and figuring out who responds to what. That is how you make more money, because streaming is not going to do it for you. It's the merch, it's the shows, it's the communities. If you have a Patreon. And so platform dependability, you can be, even if a platform isn't banned, you could just be deplatformed. They could just take your account away because they've, for one reason or another, it could be an error, whatever. I don't work at TikTok, but that is something that's always top of mind for me as a creator too, that it's so important to own your audience.
I hate the term superfan, but I think the general mentality around that conversation is completely right, because now more than ever, these passive audiences that we've been building on Spotify and these sort of anonymous numbers that we see on the public little bracket and such, they don't really move the needle anymore. And especially when it comes to then converting to things like ticket sales and merchandising and the stuff that's higher ticket when it comes to a revenue perspective, we need direct access to those people. We need direct pushes to that. And again, I think as you get bigger as an artist, getting that right just becomes more and more tangible from a revenue perspective. And constantly I'm looking to see that, right, if this is working, how do we add another zero to that revenue? How do we take it to the next step? Because sure, something just staying the same, if it's good money, it's good money. And I'd also argue that sometimes people just don't want to upset a good thing. And there's absolute merit in that as well. Don't get me wrong, but you need to be escalating. I think you also need to be moving with the times. Technology changes so quickly. I'm seeing a lot of people gravitate towards sort of like fan community platforms. Definitely. I think there's a few different variations popping up. I'm seeing a lot more people leveraging the likes of, Discord, for example, to like bring their audiences into one place. There's a great emerging platform in Sweden at the moment called Smash that again are giving people like, I would say like sort of an OnlyFans equivalent kind of model, but very much tailored to music, which is great because you look at what OnlyFans has done for its respective market, right? There isn't really a music savvy version of that. I don't think. Patreon is great, but for music purposes, not so much. Bandcamp is still really a sales platform above all else and such. So I'm seeing more and more people trying to fill that gap. And I think that's great because I think if you can find a place where you can keep your most responsive audience and the ones that are willing to fund you directly rather than just being a passive listener on Spotify and, you pray that they pay for Spotify. And so as a result, their streams are worth more than say like somebody who can still listen with the adverts, which I think should be illegal. I don't think there should be a free tier for any of these things. I think at this stage that's inexcusable. So we should be moving away from that as well. I think building your audience doesn't cost money. Building your audience is as simple as turning up, working out who you want your audience to be, and creating content or creating channels that allow you to communicate to them. And I think you can start so simple there. You start with the base channels that everyone has access to. You work out what works best for you, what doesn't work for you. And then you start siphoning off a certain percentage of that audience to be your elected, let's call them super fans, as much as I hate that term, and such, and start using them as the folks that you can test the water with. I also think a real superpower right now is fan accounts, because what I love about fan accounts is while you protect your own brand values on your main channels, fan accounts, they can be throwaway. You can trial and error that, and if it doesn't work, it's not directly attributed to you. It's attributed elsewhere. And I think a lot of people are using fan accounts really well to get sort of like ideas ticking, or at least validating them before they then start translating them over to their actual main accounts and such. And so that's a good place to start. I also think digital advertising, that offers a certain level of transparency. You can see what does and doesn't work. You can see how your targeting is actually translating and converting. You can control how much or little you do spend there, and you can start very simple there as well, I think. So getting your audience segments right from a digital advertising perspective, having those sort of like almost side funnels like your fan accounts or like your community pages and such, I think that's a good place to start. And then owning as much access to UGC creation as possible. Because if you can create a world in which you can get several hundred people using your records in their own short form content rather than having to buy it or pay for it, the privilege of that, then you're going to save a fortune, really, because you can be spending thousands of pounds to get the exact same outcomes.